So my New Year's message is one of encouragement to all of you to keep rowing. That's the name of the lesson this morning, and it's just a snippet from John chapter 6, verse 17 that I'm using as kind of the anchor for the topic about keeping on and then keep rowing. Because John chapter 6, verse 17 says, "It was dark now, and Jesus had not yet come to them." I wanted to share with you some thoughts from a young missionary which were excerpted from his journal during his first month on the mission field. So on the flight to the missionary field to which he and his wife are going, he writes, "The next time this plane touches down, I will be a missionary. To God be the glory." The second day, he reflects, "I keep reminding myself that the homesickness is just temporary. It comes with weariness and adjustments. I must remember the reason why I'm here, not for my own joy or for my own gain, but for the growth of God's kingdom." By day 3, his spirits are up. "God, it's grand, and it's a grand blessing to be serving you." But on the 4th day in his journal, he says, "It's difficult for us to think about home. We cried this morning." And then on the 5th day, he doesn't bounce back like he did on day 2. "Today is not so clear," he writes. "The clouds have buried the mountains, and the sky is gray." And by day 6, you can start seeing the storm coming in on his life. He writes, "Yesterday was the toughest day thus far. The newness is gone. I'm tired of this language. We could hardly think of our family and friends without weeping." On the 8th day, this incoming storm has now seen the waves starting to crest, and the winds are blowing, because he writes, "This hotel room, which has been our home, is cold and impersonal. I held my wife as she wept, and we both confessed the ugliness of the thought of spending the rest of our lives in this foreign country. We are so far from home." And by the 10th day, a week and a half into this new ministry, the gales of this person's life are in full force and effect. He writes, "Doggone it, I know God is guiding us. I know He has a plan for us, but it's just so hard. How will we learn this language? Lord, please forgive my sorry attitude." And just when you think it couldn't possibly get any darker, here's what he writes. "I wish I could say I'm thrilled to be here. I'm not. I'm only willing to be here. My commitment to be a missionary feels like a prison sentence." And I'm wondering if maybe the disciples that we're going to be talking about from John chapter 6 maybe had kind of the same idea and the same feelings as this missionary. Because what we know from the story, as we'll explore, is the disciples only did what they were told. They didn't question the order. They simply obeyed it. And they could have objected. This is the scenario in which Jesus tells his disciples to get in the boat, cross the Sea of Gethsemane, go to Caesarea, and he'll meet them there. So Jesus says, get in the boat. They listen to him. They didn't question his authority. So they get in the boat, and they get out in the middle of the Sea of Galilee, and we know that there's a storm that's brewing. And they could have objected to Jesus' instruction. I mean, after all, it was evening, and darkness was only minutes away for them. But Jesus told them to get into the boat, and so they did. And what was the result of their obedience to Jesus' instruction? Well, John's very crisp description of the following events will tell you everything you need to know. Because John writes in John chapter 6, verses 16 through 18, "That evening, Jesus' followers went down to Lake Galilee. It was dark, and Jesus had not come to them. The followers got into a boat and started across the lake to Capernaum. By now, a strong wind was blowing, and the waves on the lake were getting bigger. That's kind of a chilling phrase, I think. Jesus had not yet come to them. You see, church, the disciples were caught in this storm of not yet. They did exactly what Jesus said, and look what it got them. A night on a storm-tossed sea with their master somewhere on the shore. You know, it's one thing to suffer for doing what's wrong, but it's an entirely matter altogether, isn't it? To suffer for doing what's right. But it happens. And when the storms burst, it washes away this very naive assumption that most of us have, that if I do right, I will never suffer. Just ask the faithful couple whose crib is empty and whose womb is barren. Just ask the businessman whose hard and honest work is rewarded with financial ruin and bankruptcy. Or the student who took a stand on the college campus for the truth and gets mocked. Or the co-ed who took a chance on love and gets raped. And so the winds blow. And so the boat bounces. And so the disciples are wondering why the storm. And oh, by the way, where's Jesus? You know, it's bad enough to be in a storm, right? But to be in a storm by yourself, all alone? The disciples had been on the sea for about 9 hours now. And John tells us that the disciples had been rowing for at least 4 miles. John chapter 6, verse 19. Well, church, that's a long night. And that's a lot of hard work. To be out on a restless sea with waves presumably in the 8 to 10 foot range, because that's what happens on the Sea of Galilee during these moments. Can you imagine being out there for 10 hours, rowing a boat among waves like that for roughly 4 of those same 9 or 10 hours? That's a long night. And how many times do you think those disciples in that boat had been searching in the darkness for their master? How many times did they call out his name? Can you imagine being in the boat with these disciples, knowing that Jesus has told you, get in the boat, go to the other side, I'll meet you there. And in the middle of this, having obeyed Jesus, they are in the middle of a maelstrom, and they are panicked, and they are fearing a possible death. How many times do you think they were saying, great, where are you, Jesus? You said, get in the boat. We got in the boat. Where are you? Aren't you coming? Don't you care? Won't you help me? Don't you see what I'm going through? Why was Jesus taking so long? Better yet, for us, sometimes in our life, why does it seem that Jesus takes so long? It reminds me of my children taking piano lessons. Now, many years ago, my wife and I had purchased a piano, and me being, I guess, the practical or the pragmatic one, fearing that this piano, which was a petite grand piano, so it was a nice piano, I had this fear that it was just going to become a very expensive piece of furniture. So 2 things. First of all, we had installed on this piano, at least at the time it was cutting edge, but it made it essentially a player piano. And you took these hard discs and you stuck it in the machine, and the piano would play all by itself. It was beautiful. So you could have like a concert in your house and nobody had to sit at the piano. So it was an entertainment piece that resolved some of my concerns. But also fearing that it was just going to become a very expensive piece of furniture, I wanted the kids to learn how to play piano. Now, I grew up playing the accordion, so I can sit down at a piano and play the piano with some difficulty at times, but at least I can read notes and I can do what I need to do. The children couldn't. So here was the deal. The children were excited about getting a piano, so I said, okay, here's the plan. For the first year, I want each of you, and I had 3 children, to take piano lessons. After the end of that first year, if you decide to continue on, God bless you. We'll support you. If at the end of the year you say, I hate it and I don't want to ever touch a piano again, okay, you don't have to play the piano. So by the time my children had reached the last 6 months of their lessons, the teacher had now very much upped the ante in terms of what she was teaching them to play. Because they weren't playing these rinky-dink songs like Chopsticks. Da, 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 da. It wasn't that. They weren't allowed to play these rinky-dink songs and no more nursery rhymes. It was time in the teacher's eye to move on. And so the rhythms are now varied, and the notes are sharpened, and the key is changing. And I remember thinking, listening to the children play, that it would be a very pleasant sound someday. Because it wasn't then. But, the notes came along gradually. The fingers were dragging. The kids would have quit if I had given them the chance. So was I a cruel dad for urging them to continue? Was I being unfair with them and prodding them to practice? Because I wasn't oblivious to their struggles. I could hear it. They were struggling. And I wasn't blind to their tears because I remember my daughter crying, saying, Daddy, do I have to continue playing the piano? I knew that my kids would be much happier swimming or reading or watching TV. So then why did I let my kids suffer through piano lessons? Because I love them and I love them still. And I knew that their struggles then would result in music tomorrow. And Mark tells us that during the storm, Jesus, quote, saw his followers struggling. That's Mark chapter 6, verse 48. In other words, church, through the night, Jesus saw them. Through the storm, he saw them. And like a loving father, he waited. He waited until the right time. He waited until just the right moment. He waited until he knew it was time to come, and then he came. All right, well then what made it the right time? I don't know. Why was the 9th hour of that night better than the 4th or the 5th? Well, I can't answer that question either. Why does God wait until the money's all gone? Or why does he wait until the sickness has lingered? Why does he choose to wait until the other side of the grave sometimes to answer prayers for healing? Again, church, I don't know. I only know that God's timing is always right. All I can say is that God will do what's best. In Luke chapter 18, verse 7, the doctor writes, God will always give what is right to his people who cry to him night and day, and he will not be slow to answer them. Though you hear nothing sometimes, God's still speaking. And though you see nothing changing in your life, God is still acting. With God, there are no accidents. There are no coincidences. Every incident is intended to bring us closer to God. It's like the story of 2 maestros who had attended a concert and they were listening to this very promising young soprano, opera singer. And one of the maestros commented on the purity of her voice. Oh, she sings like an angel. The other responded, yes, but she'll sing better once her heart is broken. Because there are only certain passions learned by the pain. And there are times when God, knowing that, allows us to endure the pain for the sake of the song. So what does God do then while we're enduring this pain? What does He do while we're in this storm? I think you'll like this. What does God do? Jesus prays for us. He prays for us. Remember, Jesus wasn't in the boat with His disciples, right? And why was that? Because He was on the mountain praying. He had gone to the hills to pray. That's what Mark says in Mark chapter 6, verse 46. Jesus was praying for them. And I think that's pretty remarkable. It's even more remarkable to me that Jesus didn't stop praying when He heard His disciples were struggling. So He sends the disciples out on the boat. He knows they're in this maelstrom of a storm. He can hear their cries calling out to Him, "Where are you?" And what is Jesus doing? He's praying. When He heard their cries, He remains in prayer. Why? Why did Jesus do that? Well, I think there's two possible answers. The first is that Jesus didn't care, or the other is that Jesus believed in prayer. And I think you probably know the correct choice. And you know what? Jesus hasn't changed. He still prays for His disciples. The Hebrew writer in Hebrews chapter 7, verses 24 and 25 says this: because Jesus lives forever, He will never stop serving as a priest. So He is always to save those who come to God through Him, because He always lives asking God to help them. Okay, but if that's true, then where does that leave us? While Jesus is praying and we're in the middle of this storm, what are we to do? The answer actually is pretty simple. We do exactly what the disciples did in our story. We keep rowing. The disciples rowed most of the night. Mark says in Mark chapter 6, verse 48, that they were, quote, struggling hard to row the boat. That's probably an understatement, because we know that they're out in the middle of the Sea of Galilee, which has these tempests come up from time to time, and it would be a little difficult to row a boat amidst 10-foot waves and gale force winds. But what I found interesting is that the writer, Mark, says that they struggled hard. In his gospel, the word struggle is elsewhere translated as the word tormented. In other words, it wasn't easy and it wasn't glamorous. And much of our life is spent rowing, getting out of bed, fixing the lunches, turning in the assignments, changing the diapers, paying the bills. It's all routine. It's all very regular. And it's a lot more struggle than it is strut. And it's a lot more wrestling than resting. I mean, you thought marriage was just going to be a lifelong date, right? You thought having kids was going to be like babysitting them. You thought that the company hired you right out of college to find out what bright and brilliant ideas you could bring to this new business organization that you had recently joined. Then you learned otherwise. The honeymoon ended. The IRS called, and the boss wants you to spend the next week in a locale called Screamer, Alabama. Sure, there are moments in our lives that are glamorous and days where we celebrate. I mean, we have our share of feasts, no doubt. But we also have our share of baloney. And to have the first, sometimes you endure the second. You see, church, at the right time, God comes. In the right way, God appears. So don't bail out. Don't give up. Don't lay down your oars. He's too wise to forget about you, and he's definitely too loving to hurt you. And when you can't see him sometimes through the storm, trust him, because he's praying a prayer that he himself will answer. So, my encouragement for 2019 to all of you is to stay in the boat and keep rowing. Because without Jesus in your boat, if you're rowing by yourself, you're just going to row in circles. You won't go anywhere. 2018 has been a great year for some of us, and it's been a difficult year for others. And the news flash is 2019 at least has the appearance that it will be very much the same. Depending upon what your interests are, depending upon what you do in life, depending upon your age, 2019 is going to have its share of challenges. It's going to have its share of blessings too. But most importantly, just stay in the boat and keep rowing. Because Jesus is watching. He hears you all the time, Richard. And all the time, God is good. So stay in the boat. Keep rowing. He hears you. He's praying for you. And at the right time, he will come to you. And he will provide you with what you need. That's a lot to be encouraged about going into 2019. So that's my New Year's message for you this year. I hope 2018 has been a blessing to you. I hope 2019 is an even more blessed year for all of you. I hope he blesses this church with many more to come and share in this fellowship. One thing that Sherry mentioned to me this morning, because she comes about this time every year, and this, I think, is her third time. What she said to me in the Bible class this morning was, you know, you have just such a nice family here. It feels comfortable. It feels friendly. It feels like you're home. And that's the kind of thing that I think makes this an attractive body to invite others to come attend, because we can love on them. I was talking to somebody here this past week who's really struggling with what church should look like. And I said, you know, the problem is that a church is like a hospital. It's where sick people spiritually come to worship in one body. And so if you're coming to a church to find a bunch of well put together people, well, they might give you that appearance on the surface, but underneath, everyone is struggling. Everyone has issues. And what we're all trying to do is identify how we can collectively as a family address those issues together. And that's what a family does. Not everybody is a hand, not everybody is a leg, not everybody is a head or an eye or a nose or even a gallbladder. Which, by the way, I don't know why we were given gallbladders if you could easily remove them, but it is what it is. We all have an important role in this family. And your role here in this church family is infinitely more important, because you bring something to this family that nobody else can. So stay in the boat, keep rowing, and know that God hears the struggles, he's praying for you, and he'll arrive at just the right time. So we've selected a song. Can you go to the next slide, Arlene? Thank you. Standing on the promises. God has promised that he'll be there. He's promised to be faithful. We stand on those promises. So we're going to stand up. We're going to sing this song. If you have any prayer requests, you can hand them up at this time, and then we'll pray for those and then be dismissed. Let's stand.